Hi, I'm Amy Talluto, and I'm recording this on Thursday, March 27th, 2025, in upstate New York, in the United States. I'm originally from New Orleans, Louisiana. Well, I grew up in New Orleans mostly, but there was a little bit of a pit stop in Wisconsin and Wyoming as my dad got transferred for his job for about 4 years. But then we ended up back home in New Orleans. And both my parents are mirror images of each other in a lot of ways. They're both Sicilian and Cajun French. I remember being a middle class kid there. I loved reading all the Nancy Drews at the local library. I like the city because it's a real melding of cultures. It's a bit of a spooky city. There's a lot of cemeteries around because everyone has to be buried above ground. In fact, there's even a Talluto tomb. It's sort of a magical place in a lot of ways because it has such a long history, even with voodoo and all that sort of thing. I remember going to Mardi Gras parades, catching those beautiful beads, which were actually plastic necklaces that were thrown from these brightly colored floats. It wasn't all plastic necklaces. Sometimes there'd be flutes shaped like snakes, little toys, decorated plastic cups, and doubloons that were shiny metallic coins. And the beads came in all different shapes and sizes. The most prized were the pearlescent necklaces, made of plastic, of course, but they looked like pearls. And they were all different designs and colors, and it was a very exciting event to be at as a child. I went to Catholic school in New Orleans. There's a big Catholic community there. And I feel like my childhood was sort of filled with gory statues of saints and religious figures, meeting their bloody demise in sculptural form were everywhere, in the niches of the church or even in the cafeteria line when you went to get your lunch. There was a statue there also. And so, they're busy killing a snake or they are bleeding from some orifice. So there was a lot of blood and gore, which I think is kind of typical of the Catholics. But I remember that very, very strongly. And my first ever job was helping this lady who made replication sidewalk chunks. In New Orleans, they have these famous sidewalk corners that have the name of the street spelled out in mosaic tile. And they're very, famous and people go to see them. So she would recreate the sidewalk corner for people to buy and maybe hang on their wall. And my job was to paint all the little stones. So there'd be all these blank little stones to imitate the concrete. And I would paint them all as realistically as possible. So that was sort of my first real art job. There was also a great museum in New Orleans called the New Orleans Museum of Art, which I spent a lot of time at as a kid. My favorite painting that they had was a painting by the Chicago imagist Jim Nutt. It was called Sliding Slowly, Softly. And it was a portrait, but not a typical portrait. It was a featureless face, kind of made up of this purpley pink stuff, kind of bulging and squishing in there, in rivulets almost. And then the face was surrounded by this big coiffure of shiny blue-black hair. And then also another show I remember very clearly was a traveling show that had come from Cincinnati to New Orleans. And it was called Making Their Mark. And it was a show of women artists from all over the country. And it was my first exposure to the breadth of American art, especially by women artists, that I had ever seen before. And it was in 1987, not to date myself too bad, but there were artists like Jennifer Bartlett, Faith Ringgold, Linda Benglis, Laurie Anderson, Elizabeth Murray, and many more. And I remember that show as being very exciting. it made me feel like it was possible to be an artist, especially a woman artist. I'm not sure if being from New Orleans per se is indicative or palpable or a strong kind of sense in my work. But I do think that that sort of magical thinking, beautiful jewels flying through the air, gory Catholic saints and their statuary are all mixed up in there somehow, and it all comes out in the work, whether I want it to or not. My biggest artistic influences right now are Merritt Oppenheim. I love how this surrealist artist blended her ideas into sculpture and work on paper and painting, and it all kind of hangs together as a different expression of the same idea in many mediums. And I also love how she allows her titles to expand the work versus just describe. I'm influenced by Matisse. I'm doing a project now where I use doodles of his palette, his colors in 6 of his paintings and making them into sculptural form. And also I love the exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art called the Red Studio recently, a couple years ago, that showed the objects in his studio paired with the painting of the Red Studio. And I thought that was very exciting, and it felt like time travel to me to see a little sculpture in real life, and then beyond it, the painting of that little object from, 1946 in the painting. I thought that was very interesting. I love Charles Birchfield, American magical realist painter. And I've been recently really interested in Cy Twombly, and I've been attracted to how he would gouge marks into the paint. I love the artist Forrest Bess and the simplicity with which he depicts his visions and ideas. I love Sonia Delaunay, especially because she dabbled in the ballet and costuming for the ballet, which is something I recently had to do for an organization called Norte Mar. And visual artists were paired with choreographers, and we all put on short ballets. And so I was charged with making props for that, and also made some costumes. And so anyone in history who's dabbled in the ballet, I'm very interested in. And that brings me to Florine Stettheimer, an artist who is American but was living in Europe. And she watched a Ballet Russe production. I think it was called The Afternoon of a Faun. And the performance made her so inspired that she developed her own ideas for her own ballet. And she made these sculptural maquettes with fabric costumes and color, and they're on wire and set into blocks. And then also she did these beautiful watercolors of the dancers in costume and all the props. And they were so exciting to see, again, in that Merritt Oppenheim way of someone really visualizing an idea in many forms. The saddest part about the story is that she had to leave Europe in 1914 ahead of the war, so she never got to realize her ballet. Her ballet was called, her imaginary ballet was called Orpheus of the Four Arts, or in French, Orphée of the Quatre Arts. So anyway, that was just a very exciting discovery for me. Her imaginary ballet props and designs and plans. And you can see many of them yourself on the Museum of Modern Art website. So what I'm focusing on these days is kind of trying to transition out of making all those props for the ballet performance into a studio practice again. So I've been starting to paint again, and also inspired by Florian Stedheimer, doing some little maquettes of my own, seeing if the props that I made for the stage could become smaller sculptures and blending that with the maquette idea. I'm also preparing for a solo show coming up in just about a month at the Garrison Arts Center in New York called Skeleton Key. There are so many challenges to being an artist. It's hard to name just one. I think of course you have to, find a way to fit it into your life, work, but hopefully not work too much that you use up all your time. It's so tempting to do a good job at your job because you get a lot of positive reinforcement versus the studio where it can be very lonely. You could be, undergoing a career lull or, maybe not getting any attention for your work, and it's hard to motivate yourself to keep going. Also, perhaps as you go along, it's easy to get stuck in a rut. It takes courage to jump the tracks, so to speak, and invent a new way of working, be open to changing your work. I think an advantage that an artist could count is high energy, too. If you have a lot of energy, you can work at night, work in between the cracks, find a way to make your work no matter what the limitations are. It's they say it's cliche, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I do think that's true. It's about building a life in art versus, collecting a booklet of validation stamps. The joy should be in the making versus the, acclaim or accolades. Of course, we all want those, but you have to sort of reset if you feel like you're getting too focused on those sort of things. Because then if they go away, you might not be able to recover and continue working. If I had to talk to my younger self, I think I would say keep the faith or have faith. Have faith in myself. Because so many times I've been scared to do things, for example, have a child or move out of the big city, and I questioned whether I'd be able to handle that. But trust yourself. If you're committed to your work, you'll always move forward. You'll always find a way to do it. I love working in as many mediums as possible. I love working in sculpture and painting. I love acrylic paint, oil paint, metallic paint. I love working in pencil on paper. I love working in craft clays, but also ceramic. I like to use wire armatures and glue things onto other things. So I love all the ways of working. It feels really fun to be able to express your idea in so many different ways. And some of the ways can be a little unexpected, but I think that's sort of the fun of being free in your art practice, being free to flow wherever you wish. For example, right now, I'm making these sculptures out of a home craft clay called Sculpey, which is a polymer clay, and you bake it in your oven. And then on top of that, I'm doing paper mache, paint, also gluing polyfill or that kind of fluffy stuff that I've dyed. And then the whole thing is put on a wire that is drilled into a wooden block base that's painted. And then there's also some tulle or mesh kind of fabric dangling down on some parts to look like rain. So there's a lot of stuff going into that sculpture, but it's really fun to work that way. It's fun to just throw everything but the kitchen sink at something and see what happens. I love listening to audiobooks in the studio because the story kind of keeps my mind occupied, so things feel cozy. And it's sort of a ritual for me, which I'm sure many artists share, but playing the same sort of thing kind of cues your mind, almost like Pavlov's dog ringing a bell. it's time to work. And so it's a shortcut into getting back to what you're doing. And for whatever reason, I have chosen audiobooks. And I tend to listen to audiobooks set in the Jane Austen era. So I listen to a lot of like 1820s, 1840s style books. It's enough to relax me so that I can really just feel free and focused and get right back to my work. In the past, I burned through all of the Agatha Christie mysteries I could, and I've listened to them so many times over that I had to find a new resource. But in the past, there was also Agatha Christie. My favorite reactions to my work are when people describe what they see. I think that my work sometimes can be a bit inscrutable, and that's what makes it wonderful to hear what people find in it or see in it or describe in it. For example, there was a review of mine and choreographer Margaret Wiss's ballet project and my props for the stage by writer Lee Donlin. And the reviewer had to try to describe the props. And so it was so delightful to read her description. She said that the sculptures, the largest appeared like a sun god, standing about 12 feet tall with a square head and golden flowing fabric arms, which created a sort of yellow brick road for the dancers. The ingenious, abstract alien cactus costumes and all-seeing glow-in-the-dark eyeballs felt both ancient and futuristic, end quote. So to me, that is the best, to have somebody try to describe my somewhat inscrutable work back to me. I think I love these sort of descriptions because to me, every painting has a specific story in my mind, and it's crystal clear to me what's occurring. It's a mix of things that mean something to me, blended with other things, and the whole is a sort of message to myself. And so I realize that is not available or immediately apparent to the viewer, and so it delights me to hear what they see in the work. I guess what I want people to take away from the work is a feeling, perhaps an emotion that they're getting, that's transmitting out of the work. I want the work to have its own internal soul that lives without me there. I want them to feel freedom. I want them to see imagination at play and to be surprised. Thank you so much for watching my video. You can find me on Instagram at Talluts, Talluts, or on my website, amytalluto.com. I also do a podcast called Pep Talks for Artists, if you're interested in that kind of thing. And I have a solo show, as I mentioned, coming up at the Garrison Art Center, which you can find more information about at garrisonartcenter.org. Okay, that's it. Bye.